A windstorm near Stovepipe Wells once stripped away desert sediment and exposed a cache of objects so fragile they had never even been fired. On Hunter Mountain, the opposite happened. A Navy jet exploded overhead, burned roughly 200 acres of pinyon forest, and apparently damaged the microscopic dating information inside obsidian artifacts that survived the flames. At Saratoga Springs, there was no fire at all. Collectors simply carried archaeological material away decades before professional excavation began. That is the problem running through Death Valley. Archaeology does not preserve everything people leave behind. It preserves whatever survives water, heat, wind, erosion, looting, and time. And this landscape has been editing the record for roughly 10,000 years. More than 2,000 archaeological sites are already known across Death Valley. Parts of the early archaeological sequence reach roughly 7,000 to 5,000 BCE, thousands of years before Egypt's first pyramid. 10 places and archaeological landscapes made this list. We begin on a white salt basin where Alice Hunt recorded more than 650 sites, and stay until number 2. That windstorm near Stovepipe Wells uncovered something archaeologists had good reason to underestimate. Number 10. Death Valley. Salt pan. Archaeological landscape. The empty lakebed that wasn't empty. The basin is pale, broad, and ringed by mountains. Surface water is almost absent. The archaeological features are easy to lose against that scale. Low stone circles, storage features, traps, places where people stopped, worked, and lived. Then you see the numbers. Alice Hunt's Salt Pan project recorded more than 650 archaeological sites. Excavations included 5 rock mounds, 5 storage pits, 1 dwelling, 1 shelter, 6 rock circles, 6 rock traps, and a fireplace. This was not an empty landscape. The deeper chronology goes much further back. Across Death Valley, the archaeological record spans roughly 10,000 years, and the early Clare Spring, or Death Valley I, complex is conventionally placed around 7,000 to 5,000 BCE. Egypt's Step Pyramid of Djoser belongs to roughly 2667 to 2648 BCE, so the title's basic age claim holds. Human evidence in Death Valley predates the first Egyptian pyramid by thousands of years, but one distinction is enough here. Hunt's 650-plus salt pan sites do not all belong to that earliest period. They represent different activities and different moments in a long sequence. The landscape itself explains part of the apparent contradiction. National Park Service research points to ancient lake margin and riparian environments that supported occupation and food processing more than 6,000 years ago. Places that now seem almost unusable were being used under different water and ecological conditions. The desert changed, the archaeology remained. Hunt and William J. Wallace spent much of the 1950s and 1960s building the framework archaeologists still use to discuss Death Valley's cultural sequence. Some individual features remain difficult to date or interpret precisely, but the broad fact is secure. People repeatedly used a landscape that modern eyes can badly misread. And this is not a story about people simply disappearing. Death Valley remains the ancestral homeland of the Timbisha Shoshone. The archaeological resources are protected today. They cannot be dug, removed, collected, or disturbed. Among Hunt's finds were rock mounds. Keep those in mind. The next problem begins with a pile of stones barely high enough to dominate anything. Number 9. Central Death Valley Stone Mound Sites. When a pile of rocks became an archaeological period, some measured only 6 to 18 feet across and roughly 1 to 3 feet high. Low stone mounds on gravel benches. Nothing monumental. William J. Wallace found that at least some contained much more than their surface shape suggested. Excavation beneath 2 mounds revealed boulder-filled grave pits and associated artifacts. That was enough to make the features archaeologically important. It was not enough to make them simple. Wallace, Alice Hunt, and J. Peter Redwine eventually devoted a separate 1959 study to Death Valley's stone mounds. Hunt's Salt Pan project had also excavated 5 rock mounds. Wallace used mound evidence while defining what he called Period 3 in the early Death Valley cultural sequence. Then he qualified his own framework. The period still needed better definition because the evidence, at that point, rested heavily on only 2 excavated mound contexts. That is the useful tension here. A mound is an observation. A chronological period built partly around it is a model. Similar piles of stone do not automatically mean the same activity, the same age, or the same people. Excavating one burial context cannot turn every visually similar mound across Death Valley into another example of exactly the same thing. Wallace knew that. The older terminology still matters because it shows how Death Valley archaeology was assembled piece by piece, often from a frustratingly small sample. And some of these locations contain mortuary contexts, which is why precise locations do not belong in a visitor itinerary. The mounds survive today as protected archaeological features. What changed was the confidence archaeologists were willing to place on them. 2 excavated piles of stone once helped support an entire cultural period. The man proposing it was also the man warning that 2 piles were not enough. Number 8. Hunter Mountain Fire Archaeology. The jet crash that burned the clock. Stone can survive and still lose information. Hunter Mountain proved that in August 1990. A Navy jet exploded above the Panamint Range. Burning wreckage ignited roughly 200 acres of pinyon forest. Once hazardous material from the crash had dissipated, archaeological work documented cabins, house pits, rock rings, and artifact scatters. Evidence showed people had been using the area for at least 1,000 years. Then there was the obsidian. X-ray fluorescence identified material from at least 13 different obsidian sources. Some lay more than 100 miles away. That tells us the stone traveled. It does not tell us exactly how. People could have acquired it directly, exchanged it, inherited it, or moved it through several hands. The geography is secure, the social route is not. But the fire had created another problem. Obsidian hydration dating relies partly on microscopic changes in the volcanic glass, and those changes are sensitive to temperature. The Hunter Mountain researchers concluded that the fire had apparently destroyed the hydration dating potential of artifacts at some locations. The flakes were still there. The information used to date them was not necessarily intact. The Park Service later turned that accident into a controlled archaeological experiment. Before a prescribed burn on Hunter Mountain, archaeologists analyzed obsidian artifacts, returned them to the treatment area, and planned to test them again afterward to see how the hydration bands changed. A military accident had produced the question. Fire management became the laboratory, and notice where we are now. The countdown started on the Salt Basin. Hunter Mountain pushes us into high Panamint Pinyon country. Death Valley archaeology does not sit at one elevation, because Death Valley was never one human environment. We will come back to that. For now, the preservation problem is enough. A black obsidian flake can survive a forest fire looking almost exactly as it did before. Its archaeological clock may not. Number 7. Upper Warm Springs, Hunting Blinds, Saline Valley. 60 walls, pointing at the same water. Drop back into Saline Valley, and the evidence changes shape again. 60 piled boulder features were recorded within roughly 1 square kilometer around Upper Warm Springs. A 19th century observer struggled with them. Graves were considered. So were wind shelters. Richard A. Brooke approached the question spatially. Where were the walls? What did they face? What moved past them? Distances between the features and animal trails ranged from several meters to about 130 meters. A majority were within 20 meters of modern trails. Brooke argued that they were hunting blinds, probably aimed primarily at desert bighorn sheep, with pronghorn as a possible secondary target. The explanation fits the geography. Water is scarce. Animals must reach it. If hunters understand those routes, a low wall becomes useful without needing to be large. Brooke also gave the interpretation its proper limit. Modern animal trails are not guaranteed to follow exactly the same paths prehistoric animals used. One caveat, then move on. The stone structures exist. Their spatial relationship with water and animal movement exists. The hunting interpretation is strong, but the target and function of every individual wall cannot be proven from position alone. The surrounding Warm Springs landscape contains camps, lithic scatters, and other prehistoric resources. It also remains culturally important to the Timbisha Shoshone. And it is remote. The National Park Service places Saline Valley Warm Springs roughly 35 miles from the nearest paved road. Upper Spring is intended to remain undeveloped. That distance belongs in the story because the archaeology is still tied to the same basic problem people faced here for generations. Water determines movement. 60 low walls surround one of the places where movement becomes predictable. You do not need a giant structure to reshape a hunt. You need to know where the animals have to go. Number 6. Saratoga Springs Archaeological Site. The site looters reached before archaeologists. Fire is not the only thing that destroys archaeological information. Sometimes curiosity does it by hand. When William J. Wallace and Edith S. Taylor excavated Saratoga Springs in the winter of 1957, they were already late. Malcolm Rogers' earlier site records described an exceptional concentration of chalcedony, felsite, and jasper manufacturing debris around the spring. They also recorded something worse. Relic hunters had removed the intact material before 1925, more than 30 years before the systematic excavation. That is a different kind of loss from Hunter Mountain. At Hunter Mountain, the object could survive while microscopic dating information was damaged. At Saratoga Springs, the object itself could survive perfectly well, somewhere else. The problem was context. An artifact inside a layer, beside a hearth, mixed with other tools, or lying in a particular feature, can answer questions an isolated artifact cannot. Carry it away without recording where it came from, and part of that information disappears immediately. Wallace and Taylor still recovered enough material in 1957 to publish a dedicated study and interpret the principal assemblage as one Amargosa II, or Death Valley III, occupation. But the interpretation could only be built from what remained. That is why the looting is not merely an ethical footnote. It altered the archaeological problem itself. Some unanswered questions at Saratoga Springs may exist because the missing evidence was removed long before professional recording began. The springs remain protected within Death Valley National Park. Archaeological material cannot be collected or disturbed, and the spring pools themselves are closed to swimming, wading, and boating. Archaeologists arrived in 1957. Collectors had been there before 1925. The difference between those two dates is part of the site forever. Number 5. Wildrose Canyon Archaeological Landscape. The Death Valley people climbed out of Death Valley. But Death Valley's archaeology does not stay on the valley floor. Wildrose Canyon makes that physically unavoidable. The canyon runs roughly 13 miles through the Panamint Range. Its floor rises from around 4,000 feet to more than 8,000 feet. Near the mouth, it can narrow to less than a quarter mile. At its broadest, it reaches about 1.5 miles, 4,000 vertical feet. That is not a background detail. It changes what resources are available, what temperatures people encounter, and how the landscape can be used across seasons. William J. Wallace and Edith S. Taylor published their archaeological work in Wildrose Canyon in 1955. It helped widen the picture of Death Valley occupation away from the famous low basin and into the mountains. Hunter Mountain already gave us one version of that. Wildrose gives us a more human one. A semicircular windscreen east of Thorndike's was historically identified as part of a summer camp used by Tom Wilson, a Death Valley Shoshone man. That attribution does not prove Wilson built every nearby feature. It does something more useful for the documentary. It gives the landscape a name, not a phase, not a complex. Tom Wilson. The broader archaeological pattern suggests people could shift between elevations as seasons and resources changed, rather than trying to endure every part of Death Valley in exactly the same way year-round. Wildrose remains publicly accessible in the broader park landscape, while its archaeological features are protected. The canyon climbs from roughly 4,000 feet to above 8,000 in just 13 miles. At the end of that climb sits a low semicircle of stone and a recorded human association. Sometimes the most useful archaeological detail is simply knowing whose summer camp someone remembered. Number 4. Kovville Rock Shelter. 3 centuries in a shallow layer of dirt. 366 artifacts came out of Kovville Rock Shelter. Most did not look especially ancient. Clement W. Megan directed the National Park Service-funded excavation, published in 1953. The collection included cordage, plant material, animal remains, and other artifacts from a shallow deposit. Most were judged similar to objects known from Panamint ethnography. A smaller group hinted at an earlier occupation, classified at the time as Amargosa II. Megan placed the shelter's principal intermittent use roughly between AD 1450 and 1750. That range is an archaeological estimate, not a set of exact occupation dates. And that is all the caveat this entry needs. The better story is continuity. Archaeological periods look clean on a page because pages require boundaries. Technologies do not have to respect them. At Kovville, much of the material resembled things known from more recent Panamint life. The past did not suddenly become unfamiliar simply because an archaeological label changed. The shelter is protected today, and unauthorized cave access within Death Valley requires a permit. Kovville's 366 artifacts did not reveal a culture disappearing on schedule. They made the schedule look less convincing. Number 3. Clare Spring and Titus Canyon petroglyphs, pictures beside the water hole. The canyon tightens until the walls stand less than 20 feet apart in places. The backcountry road through Titus Canyon runs roughly 27 miles, and near a small perennial spring, people pecked images into stone. Clare Spring still serves desert bighorn. The National Park Service connects the place with native hunting, and prehistoric petroglyphs remain on nearby rock. So part of the landscape is readable. The water explains why animals come. The animals help explain why hunters came. Then the evidence changes language. Some petroglyphs depict wildlife known from the Death Valley region. Many other designs remain undeciphered. That does not make them meaningless. It means their meaning is not securely recoverable from the public evidence available. No invented gods, no invented astronomical calendar, no confident ceremonial story, because a geometric mark looks suggestive. The rock tells us somebody deliberately made the image. The spring tells us why the place itself mattered. What the abstract designs communicated is where the evidence goes quiet, and that silence works better when the physical setting is allowed to carry it. A narrow limestone canyon, a small patch of spring vegetation, bighorn dependent on the water, dark rock carrying lighter pecked forms. The petroglyphs remain protected in place. Access through Titus Canyon can change after flood damage and repair work, and the dossier's 2026 park information included another planned repair closure. But road status is temporary. The more durable contrast is still sitting beside the spring. At Saline Valley, the positioning of stone walls helps explain what people were doing. At Clare Spring, the landscape explains why people came. The rock proves they left something more. It does not tell us how to read it. Number 2. Stovepipe Wells unfired clay cache. The wind dug it up. This is the windstorm from the beginning. It exposed human figures and miniature basketry forms, made from clay that had never been fired. William J. Wallace published the cache in American Antiquity in 1965 after it was naturally exposed near Stovepipe Wells. The objects were not durable pottery. They were sun-dried clay. That difference changes almost everything about their chances of reaching an archaeologist. Stone survives well. Fired ceramic survives well. Unfired clay can crumble, erode, dissolve, or vanish long before anybody records it. Wallace argued that the cache and similar finds showed this technology had probably been more widespread in the Death Valley region than the surviving archaeological record had suggested. In other words, absence had been misleading. Not because the objects had never existed, because fragile things are bad at becoming archaeology. Wallace also proposed a cultural history for the tradition, linking it to what older literature called an Anasazi extension into the Great Basin around AD 900 to 1100 and suggesting the practice continued much later. That remains interpretation. Stylistic resemblance can support a connection without proving exactly who moved, how knowledge traveled, or whether the transmission happened in one direction. Modern language would normally use ancestral Puebloan for the broader cultural tradition. Later work in the Eastern Sierra and Great Basin reported comparable miniature unfired clay vessels and figurines elsewhere. Some have been interpreted as ritual objects. Again, interpretation. The miniature human figures are real. The basketry effigies are real. The windstorm exposure is real. Their exact purpose is not securely known. The find spot is protected rather than presented as a public collecting location, and now the preservation theme comes all the way back. Fire-damaged information inside stone that survived. Looters removed objects from their context. Wind did the opposite. It stripped away enough sediment for something fragile to become visible before it disappeared. The archaeologists did not open this cache. The desert did. Number 1. Breakfast Canyon rock shelters. The pantry in the rock. A tablespoon. Part of a sardine can. Mesquite pods. Pinyon nuts. Basketry. Tule matting, melon, squash, and beans. After everything else in Death Valley, we end with groceries. Winter storms in 1992 damaged 2 small rock shelters, an exposed basketry, and an organic layer where hikers could see them. The National Park Service had a preservation problem on its hands. Erosion was already removing material. Recreational traffic created another risk. So, a California State University, Bakersfield team led by Robert M. Yohe II investigated the shelters before more context disappeared. This is the opposite of Saratoga Springs. There, archaeologists arrived decades after collectors had stripped away intact material. At Breakfast Canyon, they were trying to get there before erosion and human disturbance did the same thing. They found two complete food storage features. One shelter measured roughly 15 meters wide and up to 3 meters deep. The second was about 4 meters wide and 2.5 meters deep. One storage pit was roughly a meter across and 70 centimeters deep. It contained evidence of two separate episodes of use. Radiocarbon measurements from its components were reported as 100 plus or minus 70 years before present and 340 plus or minus 60. But the dates are not what makes this the right place to end. The contents do. Mesquite, piñon. Cultivated plants including melon, squash, and beans. Another storage feature contained machine-made cotton cloth, cotton string, paper, a tablespoon, and part of a sardine can. Yohe and his collaborators interpreted the cultivated plant remains as the first reported archaeological evidence of Shoshone horticulture in the southwestern Great Basin. The evidence supports cultivated foods inside the storage context. It cannot tell us with certainty where every seed was grown. Some food could have arrived through exchange or travel. One caveat? Then look back inside the shelter. For most of this countdown, preservation has been an argument about what archaeology loses. At Hunter Mountain, fire apparently damaged dating information. At Saratoga Springs, collectors destroyed context. At Stovepipe Wells, unfired clay survived almost against the odds. Breakfast Canyon preserved things archaeology often struggles to keep at all: basketry, cloth, seeds, plant foods, and ordinary household objects. The site is now closed to ordinary public access. What was recovered belongs to the archaeological record, not to a roadside display. And the ending should stay small. The oldest part of Death Valley's human record reaches thousands of years before the pyramids. But the last objects in this story are not monumental. Someone had food. Someone needed somewhere dry to keep it. Someone put it away for later. Death Valley looks empty very easily. Its archaeology says otherwise. Stone survives. Sometimes microscopic information inside it does not. Unfired clay barely survives at all. Seeds and basketry need the right conditions. Context can disappear in a fire, a storm, or somebody's pocket. For me, Hunter Mountain is the detail that stays behind. Obsidian physically surviving a 200-acre fire, while part of the information used to date, it apparently did not. Which entry stayed with you? If you enjoy researched stories hidden inside overlooked landscapes, subscribe for more.